I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. On this program, we feature leading newsmakers and the New York Times journalists who cover them. This week, the Academy Award nominations. I'll talk with New York Times film editor Stephanie Goodman about who made the cut and what it says about Hollywood. But first, affordable housing, easier said than done, and not when it violates laws against segregation. This week, the city settled an almost decade-long suit on that very issue. New York Times Metro reporter Mihir Zaveri has been covering the story and wrote about the settlement. Welcome and thank you for joining us. In the mayor's State of the City speech this week, we used to talk about real estate. Three things were important: location, location, location. Yeah. Now when you're dealing with any city agenda, it's housing, housing, housing. What did the mayor say in his speech related to housing that is remotely new?
Yeah, I think he's been beating this drumbeat since his election, of course, but more so in recent months, that we just need to build more. We have the state legislatures just getting underway now, and that's really where the ball is. I mean, the mayor and the city administration have done a little bit here and there. They're trying to upzone certain neighborhoods, trying to build a little bit of buildings here and there. But if the state legislature doesn't act and change some rules around like tax incentives and office conversions and that sort of thing, like that's pretty much,
So how much can Mayor Adams do on his own, or any mayor?
Well, how much is sort of a philosophical question in a way, right? I mean, you could go the way of some other cities and just say we're done with single-family zoning or low density zoning and just change a bunch of neighborhoods. That would piss a lot of people off, right? And so politically, that's not really seen as a viable path. So in theory, he has a lot of power, but in practicality, it's not so simple. And right now, we're in a position where there's no tax incentive for rental housing, which is what really sort of fueled a lot of the construction in the past decade or so.
There's been an agreement, I'm not sure whether you wrote about it or not, Mayor, in the Bronx about how to deal with higher density zoning. People want more affordable housing. They don't want it in their neighborhood. They don't want more congestion. They don't want more crowding. How did they reach that compromise up there?
Are you talking specifically about that one project?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was, one of the bellwethers of sort of like where people are going to sort of stand on this type of development, right? I would argue that these sort of development by development fights, they're important to pay attention to, but they sort of miss the bigger picture, which is, you can have 100-unit development, 500-unit development. We're talking about a shortage in hundreds of thousands, right? So you need to make structural changes. They came to that agreement because, this is what council members do, right? They negotiate behind the scenes with the developer. You'll give me more affordability. You'll give me more amenities. You'll give me a park. You'll give me this. And then eventually they come to an agreement. It's happened time and again. But that doesn't, again, answer the bigger question.
Tell us about this lawsuit that was settled this week.
Yeah, so that's, I think, when we talk about housing production, we're always talking about the shortage and the crisis in rents, but there's this whole other aspect of housing, especially in New York City, that's sort of underlooked, which is fair housing, which is segregation, which is how divided are our neighborhoods. There's a lot of research that says integrating neighborhoods is beneficial on a lot of ways.
And there's a lot of research that says New York is among the most segregated cities racially and ethnically.
Right, which is somewhat remarkable considering the city's diversity. I mean, it's roughly 30% white, roughly 30% black, roughly 30%. I mean, you just go on, there's a lot of diversity, but again, pockets, neighborhoods here and there. So this lawsuit was first filed in 2015, and it was about how affordable units that are basically projects subsidized by the city, how the units in those projects are divided. In the current scheme, as it still stands, but will change in the near future, half of the units in any new affordable housing development went to people who already live in that community district. So, according to the lawsuit, they were arguing, well, if your community district's already majority white, it's going to be mostly white people that are moving into these types of units.
So, how do you reconcile that with not displacing the people who are there? If you have a mostly minority neighborhood and you are not reserving the apartments for people who live in the neighborhood, other people are coming in. What about the people who have been there and are now have to look for apartments somewhere else?
Yeah, so this was one of the key defenses that the city had in the suit, which was saying, there is displacement, which they couldn't quite quantify, but there's also fears of displacement. There's, the real fear in a neighborhood that it's changing. Two things I would say to that. One, as important as this lawsuit was, we're really talking about a few 100, few thousand units, displacement may happen regardless of whether that happens. I mean, the level of shortage is so great, the desire to live in New York City is so great. So that's one thing that's happening. The second thing I would say is that, which the plaintiff said, is that even if you, basically the people who want to move into the neighborhood, people who are trying to live there, I mean, there's not really that much that's different between, like they're, as rent burdened as people who live in the area. There's no correlation between people who have grown up and lived in an area and like the level of civic engagement or something like that. There's people in need all over the place, and most of the time people are applying to housing outside of their area. I mean, this is a population of people who want affordable units, and they're mostly applying elsewhere. So what does that necessarily say about wanting to live in the same area? So the question was, whether is it just a political issue or is it a real social issue that needs to be addressed?
And it turns out to be more of a...
I think based on the test, I mean, this lawsuit had testimony from, deputy mayors, city council members, all kinds of housing officials, a lot of internal emails going back and forth. I think the political aspect was a big deal and is a big deal. I mean, it's true that you can't win a community over unless you give them something often. And this is something that you can give a community.
Not unreasonable. You've written about basement apartments, the city trying to encourage more of those to get more housing, also more single room occupancy, something that we were trying to get away from before. What is the downside of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, where we are now as a city is very different than when we were like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, right? When certain neighborhoods were disinvested, I mean, it was an opposite problem. Now we have too many people wanting to live here and too few homes to provide them. So when you think about it in that dynamic, you still have to worry about some of the old problems, right? Part of the SRO issue was that they were too crowded, they were unsanitary, they were dangerous. Does the city have the right regulatory and enforcement staff to make sure that that doesn't become a problem again? I think some people might question that. Basements, I mean, we've seen in floods and things like that, how people have drowned literally in their basement. Part of the issue is that these are unregulated. They didn't necessarily have two means of egress to get in and to get out. That's something that in theory would change if they were legalized, but you got to worry about those types of things still.
And we've seen, I think, the first grants, the first subsidies, incentives for people to convert office buildings to residential. Is that going to be a big deal in the city? I mean, we've heard a lot about the fact that a lot of the older buildings are not really convertible.
Yeah, I mean, I would say conceptually it is a big deal, right? I mean, we believe in Manhattan and Midtown being this sort of like business center where people come in, they work, and they leave. And then if we can substantially change that to housing, that sort of changes what it meant to live and sort of be in New York City, what its main draw is. However, in terms of just raw number of units, I think the city estimates something like 20,000, which again, if you look in the, compare that to the scale of hundreds of thousands, smaller drop in the bucket than maybe it's being made out to be.
This administration, like a lot of others, has talked about more affordable housing in wealthy neighborhoods. How can they afford to build that housing in wealthier neighborhoods?
That's a challenge. And honestly, often the answer has been they can't. One way to do it is, offering tax incentive, like a tax abatement, right? Give people a little bit off on their property taxes, and that would encourage them to include more below market rate units. But development costs are high. Construction costs are very high. Land costs are high. Labor costs are high, especially in these sort of high opportunity neighborhoods. So it's really going to come down to what sort of public investment can the city make, and can the state make, and then can the federal government make? These are all discussions that are happening.
We didn't see much progress on housing at the state level in the last legislative session. One of the big things was trying to encourage more affordable housing in the suburbs surrounding New York City. Is there any likelihood we'll see any progress on that in this session?
No, it's done. Yeah,
so
for now.
We don't even have to read all these stories about it.
I mean, if you want to stay up on the issue, I mean, there will probably be some people trying to push for it, but the governor's basically said she's not going to push for it. It's an election year. I don't think there's a lot of politicians who are willing to risk upsetting the suburbs in this election year. Maybe, there will be some sort of small type of thing, like they'll pass a bill that might encourage data gathering or incentives for, but I think as the governor said last session, incentives don't work in the suburbs.
Nelson Rockefeller maybe had a lot more power, a lot more prestige, created the Urban Development Corporation to override local option about those things. Why is there no leadership that could do that now? Assuming it's still a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, but just think about sort of where the power is in state government. I mean, suburbs are hugely influential. This is the state where, you know, the suburban theory was created for the, you know, the modern conception of an American suburb was, you know, Long Island and Westchester. And, you know, we have people who represent Long Island who are very influential, very wealthy. I think it's a question of politics at this point. And, you know, to the same degree, I mean, even people who might be more sympathetic, I mean, no one wants to lose control. No one wants to lose power over something. It's taken a while in other states to make that type of thing happen.
Mihir, you had a absolutely lovely story in the Times recently about Hakim meeting Hakim.
Yes.
I would urge all our viewers to look it up. It is a wonderfully warm story. Tell us how you found out about that and what it was about.
Sure. So I've been, one of the things I cover is the public housing system. And if you cover public housing, you realize that a lot of this sort of civic activism, civic leadership is typically older people who may be retired, people who, you know, which is the case in other aspects of society too. But I wanted to find someone who was young and doing something positive. And so one thing led to another, and someone told me about this young man named Hakeem Jeffrey. And I was like, wow, that sounds so similar to the congressman's name, Hakeem Jeffries. Well, it turned out they both met last year. And I thought that was sort of an interesting hook to sort of look at the life of this young man and how he sort of became involved in his community. He's basically, you know, helping tend to an urban farm in the middle of this public housing campus, helping educate people about healthy food and giving people, you know, tours of the place. And he really seemed like someone who just cared deeply about the world, and just the sort of superficial similarity to this congressman who he met, and sort of the contrast between like the paths they've taken is sort of an interesting story that you can read about.
Who says there's no good news? That was a nice one. Mihir Zaveri of the New York Times, thank you for joining us. And coming up next, we'll discuss this year's Oscar nominations. Oscar nominations were announced this week, and as with past years, it wasn't without controversy. This year, both Greta Gerwig and Margot Robbie missed key nominations for Barbie, despite the film's numerous other nominations and critical success. How far has Hollywood come since Oscars So White and Me Too put the spotlight on diversity and women? New York Times film editor Stephanie Goodman is here to talk about the surprises, the snubs, and what Tinseltown's tea leaves tell us. So, Stephanie, what surprised you about the nominations this week?
I was surprised by how international they were in both the Best Picture categories, in Best Director. In the Best Documentary lineup is entirely international. It's very unexpected.
Now, you were telling us earlier that this was sort of planned, that the Oscar nominees were a different breed this time because the pool of the people making the nominations was different, and that was a planned thing by the Academy.
Yeah, it's a little bit of an unexpected result of the Academy responding to Oscars So White and controversies over diversity and lack of women members. In 2015 and 2016, the Academy had about 5,500 members, and those members were voting on slates that were largely white or lacked women in the non-actress categories. And the uproar over that led the Academy to institute a very ambitious program to diversify its membership. So it went from a largely male, older membership to a very diverse, much more female membership. But to do that, they had to add hundreds of members at a time. They were trying to meet this goal by 2020, and they did. But to do that, they added like 800 members in a year. And they actually basically did that by going international. And so you have now members from, I think, 93 countries who are voting on the awards. So that's partly one explanation for the snubs. this membership may be more partial to international films. Another explanation for the snub of especially Greta Gerwig in the directing category is that only directors vote on that nomination. The directors branch has only about 600 members, and they are a rather elitist group overall. They've, over the years, not recognized popular films. Notoriously, Ben Affleck was left out of the running for Best Director when Argo was in the race. I mean, I just read the obit of Norman Jewison, who did Moonstruck. He wasn't nominated when Moonstruck was in the running. That's a really popular film. So there's also that.
So first of all, does relying on so many foreign members of the Academy skew the results toward, you know, a foreign element, for better or for worse? And also, why weren't there enough women or minorities of American citizenship or Americans who could be members of the Academy? Why did they have to look outside the country?
Well, that's a good question. I don't really know. That's just what they decided to do. I think it might be they were trying to avoid adding, you know, people who primarily worked in TV and other, maybe not as elite forms.
Or second tier in some way?
Yeah.
Let's say.
And yeah, exactly. I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Does it skew the results at all, make it more like a Foreign Press Association nominations or awards?
Well, we'll set aside the Golden Globes because that's its own mess. But absolutely, it does. If you look at the Best Picture category, there's 2 foreign language films in there. That was not something you would see 5 years ago. If you look at the Best Director category, and this is key, 3 of the directors primarily live and work overseas. And that's really a change from years past. Nobody's really talking about it, but that category didn't have room for Bradley Cooper for Maestro or for Alexander Payne, who did The Holdovers. And those are Americans who were also overlooked. I'll also say that there's one other aspect to this. Barbie's a comedy. It's a very, frothy comedy. And it's hard to get a comedy in nominations at the Oscars. They just are.
It's hard to be funny.
Well, I mean, it is almost, paradoxically, it's actually a harder form, but the Academy tends to reward dramas. So that's another element to the Barbie snub.
Was there a thread that tied the nominations, certainly for Best Picture, together? Was there anything that was common about them?
I mean, you could say that they were largely adult films, films for grown-ups, and they were popular. I would say this year there's a lot of engagement on the public's part in what is going to win because they have seen these films, unlike recent years.
What does getting an award mean for a film? Is it still that big a deal in terms of monetizing an award now that stuff is already being streamed on television, on Netflix, whatever? Is getting that award when it's actually presented still as important as it used to be?
It is. It means different things to different films. This year, Disney and its various units received the most awards, and they do put films in theaters, so they're concerned about box office. But for other smaller films like The Holdovers or Past Lives, a beautiful small film from A24, that it matters. Oscars bring attention, and if the ceremony does well in the ratings, that might also translate into box office. And I also say that even though films are streaming, films are also available to buy and rent online, and that is a huge revenue source. You can't discard that. What
happens now? A film gets nominated. How do they market it to the Academy members to vote on it?
There are cocktail parties and screenings and Q&As. It's pretty relentless. I've heard it likened to a political campaign. That probably isn't quite the case, but it is definitely the case that there are strategists. There's a campaign that's laid out. There's people getting in touch with editors and reporters about stories. It's a whole series of events.
Was there any film that you saw, and you saw most of them, that wasn't nominated that you thought should have been? Or any category?
Well, I'll say that I thought The Color Purple was pretty good, and it got a nomination for Danielle Brooks, who was terrific, but it missed out on every other category, and I was a little surprised by that. I would have liked to have seen Taraji P. Henson also nominated for that film. And
were there any snubs that surprised you, others?
Well, Greta. I will say that Greta Gerwig, she got is nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay, and her film is up for Best Picture, so it's not exactly like she's been overlooked entirely, but that was disappointing.
If you looked at this year's nominations compared to, say, last year or previous years, was there anything really different about them?
These films stand out as films that people actually saw and are interested in or want to go see. I will say that people are talking about Barbie, Oppenheimer, and Killers of the Flower Moon, but The Holdovers is really coming on strong. I would say that I get stopped by people asking me about it pretty regularly, and I would not discount that as a film that might go the distance. But I feel like those films are different from previous batches where you had like Nomadland and Coda. I'm not sure that people really watched those films that much. I mean, I know that they've been seen, but not
so does
widely.
that say more about the audience or the Academy? That people are going to better movies, or the Academy is nominating movies that are more popular?
I would say it says something about the Academy, but also about Hollywood. Hollywood was not greenlighting a film like The Holdovers in recent years. It's very hard to get a mid-budget film made, and I think that there's an audience for that, and like Hollywood is seeing that, but it's not. They've been going for those Marvel big-budget spectacles because they bring in tons of money, and the Academy's not interested in that, and nor should they be.
And in terms of theater attendance post-pandemic, are we sort of back to normal?
It's pretty a mixed bag. Oppenheimer and Barbie did hugely well. I'm not sure they lifted all boats, and you still have very down weeks where there's maybe one film in theaters that's doing okay and the others are not doing well at all. I think the verdict is still out.
Stephanie, we have a new film critic. What do you look for when you hire a film critic?
Well, I haven't been able to hire, I haven't had an opening in 20 years, so this is
now
actually...
Now you finally do, so what do you want in one?
I wanted somebody who would look at movies the way a reader might, or understand how a reader might look at a movie. And I also wanted a critic who was going to be able to look at the controversies of the day, which aren't necessarily about an actual plot or performance, but about what's happening on screen, interacting with what's happening off screen in society. And I wanted somebody who could write about that regularly.
Does somebody grow up wanting to be a film critic?
Oh my gosh, so many. So many. It's really a profession that many, many people are trying to make a living at, and there's very few openings these days.
Stephanie Goodman, a film editor of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up next, I'll share some personal thoughts on running for president from prison. In May 1920, delegates to the National Convention of the beleaguered Socialist Party gathered in New York to choose their presidential nominee. The result was a foregone conclusion. This would be Eugene V. Debs's fifth presidential campaign, but with a difference. This time there would be no rallies, no whistle-stop tours, no speeches, no campaigning whatsoever. While the Republican and Democratic candidates were free to court voters across the country, Debs was confined to a federal prison cell in Atlanta. He was serving a 10-year sentence for sedition. There was no question of whether he had been railroaded or whether the charges were politically motivated or whether he had been singled out or convicted on some technicality. Debs flamboyantly admitted that he had publicly opposed the draft and American involvement in World War I because he believed the coming Armageddon was being choreographed by rapacious global arms manufacturers and to no one else's benefit. The Debs campaign is dusty history, but it might bear considering among the decision in some states and the demands in others, including New York, that Donald Trump be barred from the ballot next November. He has been charged with a panoply of wrongdoing, but so far convicted of nothing. Newsreel footage of Debs accepting the nomination from his cell was cheered in movie theaters all summer. A Times editorial huffed, quote, "Few who are responsive to the appeal of the dramatic or whose hearts are sensitive to the pathos of old age and distress could stifle a responsive emotion." But, the editorial concluded, under the influence of this unreasoning mob psychology, the acknowledged criminal is nightly applauded as loudly as many of the candidates for the presidency who have won their honorable eminence by great and unflagging service to the American people. Imprisonment only heightened Debs' popularity, though. He won nearly 1 million votes nationwide, 200,000 or more than 7% in New York, twice the proportion that Ralph Nader would receive in the 2000 election. Just saying. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.